Hi, it's Clark here. You may recall another of old Grumpy Hunter's videos where he tested the speed drop with an increase in arrow weight. In that video, old Grumpy Hunter was testing the rule of thumb that for every 5 grains increase in weight, the speed drops 1 foot per second or 5 feet per second for every 25 grain change using his Barnett recurve. The end result, adding 200 grains, the speed drop averaged 4.0125 feet per second for every 25 grains change.
Old Grumpy Hunter here. Welcome to arrow weight versus momentum. Thanks, Clark, for that intro. Using the information that I got from testing in that video that Clark just mentioned, I ran some numbers through the calculators from the Death by Bungee Old Grumpy Hunter joint project. Using Death by Bungee's 400 rule, I started with an arrow weighing 400 grains with an initial speed of 400 feet per second. I added 25 grains at a time and dropping the speed by 4.0125 feet per second and went up to 500 grains. I then used the simple ballistics calculator to calculate the ballistics for each speed and arrow weight combination. The results I got should not surprise any of you. I have mentioned this many times before that a heavier object moving slowly is harder to stop than a light object moving fast.
What is the point of all of this?
I'm getting to that soon. But first let me ask you, what is momentum?
Momentum represents the mass in motion of an object. Newton's second law states that the net force acting on an object is equal to the rate of change of its momentum. The law of conservation of momentum states that the total momentum of a closed system remains constant if no external forces act on it. In simpler terms, momentum is a measure of how difficult it is to stop or change the motion of an object. A heavy truck has more momentum than a car traveling at the same speed due to its greater mass.
What about inertia?
Inertia is the tendency of an object to resist changes in its state of motion. An object at rest wants to stay at rest, and an object in motion wants to stay in motion. Inertia is directly related to an object's mass. The more massive the object is, the greater the inertia and the greater its resistance to changes in motion.
Very good, Clark. How do we want to obtain a greater momentum? For example, an arrow weighing 400 grains is shot from 2 bows, one that has an initial speed of 250 feet per second, and the other is 350 feet per second. Even though the weight is the same, the faster bow will have the greater momentum. But is that really how we want to gain momentum? Not all momentum is created equal. I've said that many times before. A 500 grain arrow with an initial speed of 350 feet per second will have the same momentum as a 350 grain arrow shot at 500 feet per second. It's just a matter of simple math. Grains times feet per second divided by 225,400. Which arrow is going to have the most momentum? Recall that Clark said that momentum is mass in motion. Looking at the images here, you can see that both setups have the same momentum of 0.776 slugs. The 500 grain arrow has an initial speed that's 150 feet less than the 350 grain arrow. The 500 grain arrow maintains more of its momentum. At 50 yards, the 500 grain arrow retains 94.59% of its momentum, where the 350 grain arrow only retains 92.27%. 500 grain arrow has as much momentum as a 350 grain arrow does at 35 yards. Getting back to the weights I mentioned before, 400 to 500 grains, with the average speed drop per 25 grains of 4.0125 feet per second, this table shows the momentum increase as the weight goes up while the speed goes down. Please note that the momentum to show on this chart, I had to multiply it by 1,000. Otherwise, it would be a flat line at the bottom. You can see that the increase in momentum parallels the increase in arrow weight. This chart shows the momentum with the arrow weight combination starting with the 400 grain arrow with an initial speed of 400 feet per second. Let's take a quick look at the amount of momentum retained by some of the weight-speed combinations. This table shows the initial momentum of all speed-weight combinations, along with the momentum at 25 and 50 yards, and the percentage of momentum retained at those yardages. There's a 20% increase in the initial momentum between the 400 and the 500 grain arrow. When we compare the speed-weight combos, you can see that the 450 grain arrow at 391 feet per second has more momentum at 50 yards than the 400-400 combo does at launch. Let's put this into real life. Many of you know that Rich from Death by Bungee and I are friends. And if you've been following Death by Bungee at all this spring and summer, you know he went back to Manitoba to hunt black bears without me, and he was successful again. As you can see in this image, Rich is holding the original bungee. According to Rich, when new, on a good day, bungee had an initial speed of 305 feet per second with a 350 grain arrow going downhill with a tailwind at 0.474 slugs of momentum. But Rich played around a little bit, and he bumped that arrow weight up to 635 grains, which resulted in a speed drop of 81.43% increase in weight, with only an 18.36% drop in speed. The new weight speed combination resulted in a 48.1% increase in momentum. At 285 grain increase, resulted in a 0.98 foot per second drop for every 5 grains. That's right at the rule of thumb. Once again, using the ballistics calculator, at 20 yards, that arrow still had 0.689 slugs of momentum. Bungee had a 20-yard shot at the bear. The 635 grain arrow had 0.689 slugs of momentum upon impact. Passed through the bear completely, went another 2 yards, and buried itself 4 inches into the ground. That's with a 3-inch swacker. No wonder Rich is smiling like that. Let's think about that for a second.
How did that slow-moving arrow with a 3-inch broadhead pass through the bear with all that resistance?
It's quite simple. Mass. Mass equals momentum. Mass equals inertia. Inertia equals penetration.
Let's think about this. The arrow was launched out of bungee, has an outside diameter of 11/30 seconds, which is just a tad bigger than a pencil, and had a very sharp point on the end. At the time of impact, the arrow was traveling at 244.6 feet per second, or 166.8 miles per hour, with a momentum of 0.689 slugs. As it said before, momentum is the measurement of mass in motion. It's the product of the object's mass and velocity. Inertia is the object's resistance to a change in motion. Earlier, Clark said that inertia is a property of matter, and more inertia makes it harder to stop an object. The greater the mass, the more difficult it is for the object to stop moving or change its direction. Momentum is a persistent force that drives the arrow into the animal. Think of it this way. Momentum is the resistive force required to stop the arrow as it passes through the hide, the tissue, the body fluids, bone, and back out the other side if possible. The force of momentum is measured in slugs. 1 slug of mass is equivalent to 32.17405 pounds.
How much force did Bungee's arrow have at impact?
0.689 slugs equals 22.16792045 pounds force. That force was moving at 166.8 miles per hour.
How much momentum do you want?
Well, how much penetration do you want? I don't know of anyone who's ever said, I wish my arrow hadn't gone through that animal. Remember, the arrow goes all the way through. There are two holes to create a blood trail. An arrow that's stuck in an animal has the potential of plugging up the hole and stopping the blood trail. To paraphrase Death by Bungie, all hail momentum.
Hi, it's Clark here. Did I just catch you watching an old Grumpy Hunter video? Are you finding it informative or entertaining? If so, why not click the thumbs up button on this video? If you like the more technical aspect of hunting with a crossbow or rifle, then you will want to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell.